It all began on the paradisiacal island of Cuba, when a successful Spanish landowner and his housewife gave birth to Fidel Castro Ruz, a man who, for some, would become a global hero in the fight for the oppressed. Although he was always raised within the Cuban elite, he would become the greatest symbol of the socialist revolution and anti-imperialism, while for others, Fidel will be a great despot, a snake charmer, a man who plunged Cuba and its people into a state of misery and humiliation.
Let no one imagine otherwise. If we dedicated ourselves to terrorism, we would certainly be efficient, but the fact that the Cuban Revolution has never used terrorism does not mean we renounce it. We warn you.
This is Reinaldo Carrillo Vilches speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia, and I invite you to learn the true story of Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. How much of what we know about it is real and how much is myth? In the peaceful and pleasant province of Holguin, in the east of the island of Cuba, Fidel Castro Ruz was born on August 13, 1927 in the Viran region. His grandparents and great-grandparents were originally from Galicia, the Canary Islands, and Asturias. His own father, Angel Castro, was Galician by birth, a soldier who was sent to fight with the Spanish royalists in the Spanish-American War, which was being fought for independence. And, enchanted by the beauty of the island and seeking fortune, he later returned to Cuba with various trades. There he gradually achieved a solid economic position, which turned him into a landowner and a reputable merchant. At the age of 47, he married Lina Ruz, who was 19 years old, a Cuban native of Canary Island descent, who worked as a housewife. In the family home of Angel Castro, Fidel, from this marriage, the already mentioned Fidel, and 6 more children would be born, including the boy Fidel Castro. At first glance, he has a happy childhood, running freely across his father's vast lands, playing with his siblings and the farm animals, and swimming in the nearby rivers. In the family photos from his early years, Fidel looks more like a porcelain doll, very different from the bearded men of the mountains. A very well-dressed and adorned boy, his father was a very hard-working and strict man, somewhat distant as well, and uncompromising. His mother was sweet, attentive, and neat. And could it be said that in his memoirs, Fidel remembers his mother with more love than his father? Although without a doubt he treats his father with more respect, more reverence, and more fear. Well, many say that in Fidel's relationship with his father and his home lies the genesis of his rebelliousness. And I quote, "In his own words, the home represented authority, and that got under my skin and my rebellious spirit began to emerge." On one occasion as a child, he supposedly threatened his father that he was going to burn down the house they lived in if his father didn't let him go back to school from where he had been suspended for being, quote-unquote, unruly. And as he began his primary education, his rebelliousness would become much more intense. But things would change in 1939. And here it should be noted that from the birth to the adulthood of Fidel Castro, he would grow up largely among the most privileged and elite circles of that region of Cuba. His school in particular was run by Jesuit priests, a Catholic organization of great influence and power. And at his school, just like in many Jesuit educational institutions, much of the high society of that region of Cuba spent their lives. There, Fidel finally begins to do well in his studies, to show greater interest in education and great enthusiasm. In addition, through swimming and hiking, areas where he develops a natural leadership over others. By 1941, Fidel is transferred to the Colegio de Belén in Havana, also run by Fidel's company, that is, by the Jesuits in Havana. Fidel continues to stand out with his grades and in all kinds of sports, and he also expands his interest in history and debate. He reads about great military figures and becomes a passionate debater in the school's debate club, where he increasingly seeks to embellish his prose to persuade those present. He will receive his first major role models directly from the Jesuit fathers, with classics like Julius Caesar, Napoleon, Simón Bolívar, and even contemporaries like Benito Mussolini, José Antonio Primo de Rivera, and Francisco Franco. The latter came from the influence of several of the same priests, some of whom were Spanish and anti-communist. It is several of these authors who will adorn the first readings of a young Fidel. And one of those he pays the most attention to is the Cuban hero José Martí, with whom he feels identified. And in numerous future speeches, he will present himself as a sort of successor to Martí. And after these studies, Fidel, at 19 years old, will face the always energetic and complex university stage. Additionally, in a Cuba that was about to enter a somewhat turbulent period. The island of Cuba, known in those years as the Garden of the Antilles, was the scene of extraordinary changes for the whole planet. The Spanish had conquered it in 1492, and it gradually became one of the most valuable possessions of that Spanish Empire. Because of its strategic position and its agricultural production, in which sugar stood out. Cuba took longer than the rest of the Spanish-American countries to separate from the Spanish crown, and it did so through a process that happened under exceptional circumstances. It wasn't until the Cry of Bear in 1895, an uprising led by the hero José Martí, that the so-called Cuban War of Independence was finally ignited. Thousands of soldiers traveled directly from Spain to fight against the Mambises, as the Cuban independence fighters were called by 1898. The United States of America, which had long been positioning itself as the hegemonic power of the American continent, decided to enter this military conflict and support the Cuban independence fighters to expel the Spanish and the Royalists from the island. But of course, this would not be for nothing with the American troops on the island. From 1898 to 1902, Cuba became, unofficially, an American protectorate, a new state, and its constitution was being drafted, which included the controversial Platt Amendment that gave the United States of America the legal right to intervene in the island of Cuba if they considered it necessary to preserve the interests of the hemisphere. Shortly after this constitution was approved, the United States withdrew its troops from the island, although it did not withdraw its direct or indirect control over it. And immediately after, the Republic of Cuba was proclaimed on May 20, 1902. During the first governments of this Republic of Cuba between 1902 and 1925, the United States, with the support of large business capital, increasingly penetrated all the key sectors of Cuban economic life: the sugar manufacturing, agricultural, construction, and many other sectors. Privileged with broad commercial and tariff advantages granted by the Cuban government. In this way, Cuban politics and life had become intertwined, either by choice, by military threat, or a bit of both, to the directives and approval of the United States. But this relationship would also generate anti-American sentiments within the island in several political groups. During that period, the standard of living for Cubans gradually improved, little by little, with the arrival of investments and new technologies. At the same time, new social conflicts began to emerge with the encounter between different social strata and ethnic groups on an island that had always been somewhat stratified. And events like the 1912 Black Uprising occur, which left more than 3,000 people of African descent dead after they had rebelled against the government. After this long period, on September 4, 1933, Sergeant Fulgencio Batista, who at that time was reputed by the military establishment as an intelligent, hard-working, and honest soldier, along with other conspirators, he is going to start a revolution in Cuba, which will remove President Cespedes from office, with the support of the army and several sectors of Cuban civil society, thus gaining prestige among the Cuban population, who at that time were demanding change. Fidel was only 9 years old when this happened, and maybe he wasn't very aware of these matters. After this coup, a new governing board was formed in which Batista had a strong influence and under the banner of Cuban independence. This new government repealed the controversial Platt Amendment and carried out several progressive reforms, such as establishing the 8-hour workday, legalizing labor unions, and distributing land among Cuban peasants. And although greater independence from the United States was sought, a pragmatic relationship with that country was still maintained. And after this period, several provisional governments came to power in Cuba, starting in 1934, and among them was Fulgencio Batista. He gradually became the strongman within the army and within the government, a government that he would go on to lead after being democratically elected in 1940, serving as the new president of Cuba until 1944. And in the midst of all this, the young Fidel Castro would enter the Faculty of Law at the University of Havana on September 4, 1945, to study law. It's worth mentioning that this young Fidel was someone who spent vacations abroad in places like the United States, where very little is known. And it's not a minor detail that during these university years and during those vacations, Fidel took the opportunity to practice acting and participate as an extra actor in several productions within the United States. But let's go back to his native island. At that time, Cuba was a dynamic and vibrant island with an energetic and joyful population. It had been less than a year since the first government of Fulgencio Batista had ended, in 1945, when he democratically handed over power to the government of Ramon Grau San Martin. Nevertheless, at that time, when Fidel was a university student, political passions on the island were at a peak, especially with nationalist political organizations and many others on the left, who raised banners for greater independence, sovereignty, and the fight against Anglo-American imperialism. At the university, Fidel witnessed the rise of two major groups, the Revolutionary Socialist Movement and the Revolutionary Insurrectional Union, which went on to take control. The University Student Federation, an organization with significant influence in Havana's politics. Fidel Castro, ambitious from a young age, set his goal to become the president of the University Student Federation. In this way, Castro would almost completely neglect his studies. He devoted himself to voraciously reading newspapers to stay up to date with national and international news. And he also read some history and humanities to shape his thinking, which was still not very clear or defined. But in Castro's first major political contest at the university, he was defeated. He lost the elections for the Federation of University Students, but his ambitions did not diminish at all. And after that, with even more energy, he took part in every kind of rally, protest, or activity that took place at the university. He gave a famous speech in November 1946 denouncing the corruption and authoritarianism of the Grau San Martin government. The speech resonated throughout the Havana community, with Castro already showing charisma and dramatic skills in communicating with the public. He begins to make a name for himself on the island, and at the same time, he also starts to be watched and pursued, not only by government authorities, but also by his own comrades. At the same time, Fidel gets closer to and gains leadership within the two movements that made up the University Student Federation. At the same time as he joins and quickly rises in prominence in Emilio's Cuban People's Party, Fidel Castro. At that time, he was a man of an impressive 1.91 meters in height, with very Spanish features and a very athletic build. To that, add a defiant and determined attitude. With his well-prepared oratory, he would go on to win the hearts of millions of Cubans. And at that time, it would help him to keep winning. followers at the university. In his own words, he was, quote, the Quixote of the university, always the target of blows and bullets, end quote. Another very recurring aspect in Fidel Castro's personality was feeling alone against the world, just as he himself once said, quote, I have been my own teacher all my life. And in that search for meaning and power, Fidel embarks on the most unlikely ventures and projects. The first of these, which is also his first armed venture, it takes place when he is head of the Pro-Democracy Committee for the Dominican Republic, which was based in Cuba, from where he organized together with Dominican dissidents an invasion of that country with the purpose of overthrowing its ruler, Rafael Leonidas Trujillo. The expedition has 4 ships, 13 planes, and about 1,200 soldiers, veterans of the Spanish Civil War and World War II, and even money from the Cuban government itself. It ends up failing in September 1947. And it's also a first great experience to learn about leadership skills, about handling weapons, and about organization for the particular guerrilla warfare. Again, in Cuba and in that same environment. Since 1948, he manages to make high-level contacts with international political organizations. A delegation from Perón's Argentine Senate arrives in that republic in Cuba to hold a Congress where a Latin American student organization would be created to raise the banners of democracy, social justice, and the self-determination of peoples. And at the suggestion of Fidel Castro, they decide that the Congress will be held in Bogota, where the 9th Pan-American Congress of the United States will also take place. A date that, for other reasons, will be remembered forever in Colombia. So Castro embarks on his first trip as a representative of the Federation of University Students for that International Student Congress. First, he makes a stop in Caracas, Venezuela, where they are welcomed by the student youth of the Democratic Action Party. So by the month of April, he is already in Bogota, where he plans to meet with the popular leader of the Liberal Party, Dr. Jorge Eliezer Gaitan. Specifically, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Friday, April 9, 1948. However, as he heads to the interview, he sees people running in all directions on the street shouting, "They killed Gaitan." It was the beginning of the bloody Bogotazo. A series of riots and disturbances broke out as a result of his assassination, which would intensify a new period of internal wars in Colombia. Fidel witnesses this event which will mark him for life. There were even speculations that Castro had some kind of active involvement in promoting these riots in Bogota. After this significant experience, Fidel returns to Cuba, continues his studies and his life as a university leader, and gets married in October 1948 to Mirtha Diaz Balart, a woman from the Cuban elite. Like Fidel, from a wealthy family with many connections, they get married a few days after Dr. Carlos Prios Socaras rises to power and becomes president of the Republic. This marriage is essential and very significant for strengthening Fidel Castro's position within the Cuban elite. For example, these are things that are also very little known. Castro Diaz Balart's father-in-law was none other than the lawyer for the United Fruit Company in Cuba. As a curious and little-known fact, Mirtha Diaz Balart's brother, named Rafael Diaz Balart, organized a meeting to introduce Fulgencio Batista, who at that time was out of power but still active in politics, to Fidel Castro, so that Fidel, who was his brother-in-law and a student leader, would join Batista's party, which was called the Democratic Socialist Coalition. This was a cordial approach, but nothing more than that. Batista and Castro were both testing the waters. As it is known, Fulgencio reportedly told Rafael Diaz Balart that Fidel Castro was intelligent but dangerous. It's at the very least striking that Fulgencio Batista not only maintained a cordial relationship with Fidel Castro, but also attended his wedding with Diaz Balart. and he gave a gift of $1,000 of that time as a wedding present to Fidel Castro and his new wife. Shortly after, in 1950, Fidel received his law degree, and even though, thanks to his wife's intervention, he was able to get a job as a lawyer, it wasn't the best paying job, and many times he had to turn to his father for money. By 1951, Fidel is 24 years old with a wife and a son, a job that's fairly well paid, a decent house, and he has the support of his wife's fortune and his father's. However, his rebelliousness and quest for power continue to drive him to relentless political action. He goes to protests, rallies, and takes part in demonstrations. This time, under the apparent membership of the so-called Cuban People's Party, also known as the Orthodox Party, which had a nationalist, anti-imperialist, socialist, pro-economic independence, political freedom, and social justice tendency. And it is through this party that, in 1952, Fidel Castro ran for the first time as a candidate for the Cuban House of Representatives. The elections, however, were canceled when, in March of that same year, a movement led by Fulgencio Batista carried out a coup d'etat, overthrowing Prio Socarrás. He did this under the pretext of restoring order in Cuba, and Batista was proclaimed as the provisional head of state. And although Batista also had significant popular support, his rise to power meant the eventual emergence of armed political groups in Cuba. Fidel began to organize an armed and subversive movement and accused Batista of violating the Constitution and promoting corruption, violence, and authoritarianism in the country, which according to him was mired in backwardness. But to be honest, isn't that image of Cuba at the time as an extremely poor and backward island before the Cuban Revolution came incomplete? While there were numerous social problems and many people lived in material hardship, especially in the countryside, the economic situation of the Cuban island in recent decades was one of constant growth and rising prosperity, with a vibrant social and cultural life beyond the casinos. In the 1950s, Cuba had the lowest infant mortality rate in almost the entire continent. It was the Ibero-American country with the lowest illiteracy rate at 23.6%. And it was the epicenter in the region for much of the latest technology, cars, the newest models, and important industrial, tourism, and infrastructure development projects. And this was largely due to its proximity to the northern power. Cuba's per capita gross domestic product was around $4,010 in 1958. And although there was inequality, the average Cuban standard of living back then was better than that of many people in the region. But this reality is one thing. And another is the fact that numerous social and political groups in Cuba opposed Batista and believed they could govern better. Seeing the discontent that Batista's coup had generated among some groups, Castro saw it as a great opportunity to make himself known nationally in Cuban politics. In less than 14 months, Fidel Castro had managed to gather about 1,200 people, and in addition, he managed to obtain a significant amount of money and weapons to carry out an armed uprising against Fulgencio Batista, which would take place on July 26, 1953 at 5 in the morning. With the initial objective of taking the famous Moncada military barracks, located in Santiago de Cuba, the assault begins at 5 in the morning on July 26, but very briefly. The operation is quickly cornered by national government forces. Many will desert while they can, and several others will be executed by Batista's forces. By midday, the revolutionaries had already surrendered and began to scatter to avoid being arrested. The assault, in objective terms, is a failure, but in political terms, it's a resounding success that gives Fidel, among other things, the public notoriety he had been seeking. After the assault, Batista began to pursue those involved in it, especially the first among them, Fidel Castro, whom, as we saw, he had met personally a few years earlier. Fidel Castro is put on trial on October 6th. There he delivers one of his famous speeches, where he ends by saying, "Condemn me, it does not matter. History will absolve me." However, it remains a subject of mystery and controversy because of the assault on the Moncada barracks, where about 80 men died. The Batista regime only gave Fidel Castro 15 years in prison. And more than that, in less than 2 years, he will be completely released, as we will see later. Once arrested, Fidel disconnects from his family and his wife, who is going to ask him for a divorce. Shortly after being imprisoned, Fidel dedicates himself to reading, studying, coming up with new projects, and inside the prison, he decides to create his own party, the so-called July 26th movement. He gives this movement a popular and revolutionary rhetoric, nationalist, anti-imperialist, and infuses it with the ideals of the hero José Martí and Karl Marx. Thus, Fidel completes the creation of that party he had long aspired to since his university years, and in the meantime, in a way that for some was surprising, he receives thanks, among other things, to the intercession of Archbishop Pérez Cervantes, Fidel Castro, and others involved in the assault on the Moncada barracks. They are released in May 1955 as part of a general amnesty and quickly go into exile. First, he leaves for the United States and then to Mexico, where Fidel begins to plan. Under the banner of the July 26th movement, a new attempt to seize power and invade Cuba. In Mexico, he meets many people already captivated by his aura as a wandering revolutionary who will accompany him in the birth of this revolution. The most remembered among them, the Argentine Ernesto Che Guevara, who quickly bonds with Fidel. And here we must also pause to show the true story beyond the myth. Fidel Castro's fledgling movement needed money, and since October 1955, Fidel Castro, the future icon of world communism, would travel to the United States to seek resources among the American elite to restore, according to them, democracy in Cuba and carry out his revolution. He obtained $9,000 from Cuban groups in various cities in the United States who opposed Batista, and, more importantly, $100,000 from former President Prio. Socarrás, who was in collusion with several American multinationals, such as the United Fruit Company, and at the same time was very little known. He got money from CIA representatives who, in addition to supporting Castro's already well-known activities, were going to contribute about $50,000. For this expedition, Fidel also received money and weapons from subversive groups in Costa Rica, Mexico, and Guatemala. And with $18,000, they bought the yacht Grandma, with which they would launch their great adventure to Cuba from Mexico. It is necessary to pause to point out the little-known fact that during his trip to the United States, and based on his already old connections with elite circles, Fidel Castro manages to meet and receive support from members of the powerful Council on Foreign Relations, a private organization that has brought together the entire American ruling and business class. And on that trip, he receives support from none other than the ultra-magnates of the Rockefeller family. A sponsorship that is more than unexpected and apparently contradictory, which it seems will last for a long time. That support would manifest itself in several tangible ways. For example, with the extraordinary and coordinated support that Fidel Castro received in the major world and American press. As we will see later, not only during the revolution but throughout his entire government, that relationship was also publicly manifested much later, with the delegation led by David Rockefeller himself, who personally visited the island in 2001 to develop unprecedented and new trade agreements and to financially save Cuba. That support and connection between Castro and the Rockefellers, as well as with other groups at the highest levels of international power, is what, according to some scholars, could have truly kept Castro in power. Beyond all the mythology of the invincible man that was created around him, it can be stated, as we will see in the facts later on, that Fidel Castro, he was the first great media creation of a global political icon. In a world population that was just beginning to have television and had never seen a phenomenon of that nature, this protection of Castro's regime by high-level government and financial actors in the United States would have been the reason, according to some researchers. The same ones who sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers to Vietnam or any other part of the world. Apparently, it was never able to do anything concrete about that small island that was just a few kilometers away and was the epicenter of continental communism. So let's go back to those months in 1956 when Castro was actively organizing the expedition to overthrow the Batista regime. After a long time of preparation and training now, with financial resources and the support secured from important members of the world and American elite, Fidel Castro and the revolutionaries are going to leave on November 25, 1956, heading to Cuba. However, after several days, the revolutionaries arrived several days late on December 5th to the island, to the area of Alegría del Pio, where other subversive groups would be waiting for them. But instead, they encounter President Batista's troops, who opened fire on the revolutionaries, killing 60 of them, leaving alive 20 of the 82 men who were with Fidel Castro. The revolutionaries have no choice but to go into what will later become the legendary Sierra Maestra. Thus began one of the most controversial revolutions in history, the Cuban Revolution. One of the mysteries that calls into question the mythological nature of the entire revolution is that when the revolutionaries go into the Sierra Maestra, General Barrera, under Batista's orders, asked for the search for the guerrillas to be stopped, allowing them to go deep into the jungle undisturbed for quite some time. So for much of 1957, the revolutionaries in the Sierra Maestra remained trapped in those mountains, in a state of constant tension with Batista's forces. Fidel will focus during these months on increasing the number of guerrillas, organizing columns, delegating functions, and distributing resources. Thus, the year begins with this group of guerrillas deep inside Cuba. On January 17, they achieve their first victory when they raid the military post at La Plata. And in the eyes of Cuba, those who were supposedly defeated when they landed had now risen from the ashes. But the most powerful weapon of the Cuban Revolution at that moment is going to be the international media, especially the American media. From the moment Fidel arrives on the island of Cuba and throughout his entire life, Fidel Castro's career is going to be widely and thoroughly filmed and photographed, as if it were a major film production, something that had never existed before in the face of the mass media revolution. So in February 1957, the American journalist from the highly influential United States media outlet, the New York Times, named Herbert Matthews, arrives in the Sierra Maestra. He interviews Fidel Castro, and once it's published, it presents him as Fidel Castro. Open quotes, a liberator who dreams of social justice, democracy, and freedom, and that Batista will never be able to defeat Fidel Castro's men. Close quotes. Reports like this one, specifically the one from the New York Times, present the untrue idea that the M-26 is an army of thousands of men, and the general editorial line with which the revolutionaries are presented wins Fidel thousands of followers, both inside and outside of Cuba. And after the New York Times, then comes Columbia Broadcasting System News, Le Monde, and other major newspapers worldwide. By interviewing Castro dressed in guerrilla attire deep in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, they are going to multiply that mythological image. It's worth saying that in all those interviews, Fidel Castro claimed that he was not a communist and had no aspirations to establish a communist regime after the revolution.
It's not communism or Marxism in our ideas. Our political philosophy is representative democracy and social justice in a well-planned economy.
Many of these media outlets were associated with the Rockefeller family or other international power groups. And one aspect that still causes mystery to this day is why Batista allowed all these journalists to calmly access the place where these dozen guerrillas were. And yet for a long time, he refused to advance militarily against the revolutionaries. After this international uproar, Castro is not the only one who takes up arms against Batista. The so-called Revolutionary Directorate, made up mainly of students, unsuccessfully mobilizes in an assassination attempt that almost succeeds against President Batista. Then in April, the revolutionaries organize themselves into several columns, led by figures such as Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos. These columns carry out assaults on places like Estrada, Palma, Boyacito, and engage in fierce combat at Ubero. A few months later, in September, the so-called Cienfuegos uprising takes place, where the revolutionaries, together with soldiers from the Cuban army, attempt a coup d'etat. They seize the Cienfuegos naval base, but it would only be temporary as Batista's forces quickly regain control of the situation. However, the coup greatly weakens the cohesion of the Cuban armed forces, which was Batista's main center of support, and his main concern beyond the guerrillas. And during these months, a fundamental event occurs. The ruling class of the United States begins to withdraw its support from Batista. Within the span of a year, they will take measures such as suspending the shipment of weapons and equipment to Cuba, imposing trade sanctions against Batista's government, and diplomatic isolation. There, at that estate, the guerrillas receive weapons provided by Venezuela under Wolfgang Larrazabal, after Marcos Pérez Jiménez was recently overthrown. And although little is known, the guerrillas also receive weapons from the United States without any clarity about which direct source these weapons came from. The year 1958 had already arrived, and after a tense pause, Fulgencio Batista launches the so-called Summer Offensive, deploying 10,000 government soldiers to the Sierra Maestra to fight against fewer than 1,000 of Castro's guerrillas. Fierce battles take place, such as those of Santo Domingo, Las Mercedes, El Machillo, and others, with numerous casualties among the guerrillas and also among the government forces, although they still had significant popular support. However, here again, in a very mysterious way and contrary to the narrative of the bearded heroes, Fulgencio Batista orders the troops to withdraw again in August. Even though they were far superior to the revolutionaries, they canceled the offensive against the guerrillas. It is at this moment of military withdrawal, now without United States support and with members of the Cuban high command turning their backs on him, that Batista begins to see himself as defeated. And taking advantage of this weakness, in 1958, Castro orders all his troops to march to conquer the main cities of Cuba. Che Guevara takes Santa Clara and Camilo Cienfuegos takes Yaguaje. This before December 30, 1958. Without the support of his main allies, Batista decides to resign from office and leaves Cuba on January 1, 1959 at 2 in the morning. Immediately, General Eulogio Cantillo provisionally assumes leadership of the state with a military junta, but this is quickly rejected by Castro with the slogan, "Revolution, yes, coup, no." In response, Fidel declares Santiago de Cuba as the new provisional capital of Cuba and orders all members of the Revolutionary Army to march toward Havana. And with that, the collapse of what remained of Batista's regime begins to take place. At the same time, in Santiago, Fidel Castro starts to form a government. Manuel Urrutia is appointed as president of Cuba. The United States of America quickly rushes to recognize this new government. And after Che and Cienfuegos finish taking control of the rest of the regiments, in the following days, Fidel Castro makes his triumphant entrance into Havana on January 8, 1959, where President Urrutia appoints him as Commander-in-Chief of the Cuban Armed Forces. Cheers and applause surround the guerrillas, as well as the 32-year-old young man who was about to take absolute power of the island. Fidel Castro Ruz will be the top ruler of Cuba for almost 60 years. It's impossible to recount step by step in detail what this long period was like, but we can talk about the main features and events that characterize this period and his rule, as well as the controversial and fateful consequences they had for the island. Although the initial government formed after the triumph of the revolution was broad-based, with various political sectors, Castro will gradually take control of the entire state apparatus in the face of an apparent lack of leadership. The following month, he manages to get the prime minister to resign so that he, Fidel Castro, would now also assume the position of prime minister of Cuba. He accepted on the condition that the powers of that position would be expanded. During those first months of 1959, the revolutionary and provisional government, which although nominally was led by Urrutia, in key aspects, the one who had the final say was Fidel Castro. He is moving forward with the very controversial so-called revolutionary trials, where those accused of collaborating with the Batista regime are being judged, where, in fact, in addition to several of his collaborators, dissidents or enemies of revolutionary organizations are also included. That's what it is. They were sentenced. It is estimated that between 600 and 1,000 people, mostly officials of the Batista regime, were executed in these trials. Several of them in controversial places like La Cabana, where Che Guevara personally took charge of several of them, earning the nickname the Butcher of La Cabana. At the same time, the death sentences of several of those convicted were carried out in public squares or stadiums and broadcast on television throughout the country. In the very first year after taking power, Castro's government began the first agrarian reform measures, as well as the expropriation of land. At the same time, a process of nationalization of large companies and assets throughout Cuba would begin, sometimes abruptly and sometimes gradually. This included the sugar sector, the mining sector, and the economy in general. Expropriations that were sometimes compensated and sometimes not, affecting many Cuban owners as well as American or other foreign owners. Refineries like Standard Oil and Shell were among the first to be nationalized. Many members of Cuba's upper and middle class began to leave the country. Later, there would even be the mass expropriation of thousands of small businesses, a policy that would continue for more than a decade, and from the very beginning of these economic reforms. Formal relations with the United States became increasingly strained, eventually leading to a break in relations and the establishment of a trade embargo on the island, which we will mention again later. In April of 1961, this happens in the context of conflict. The infamous slavery led to the invasion of the Bay of Pigs, where American soldiers, along with troops of dissident Cubans, attempted to overthrow Fidel Castro, with support from the United States government and armed forces. But the invasion ended up being a failure because groups from the CIA and the ruling class of the United States gave Castro all the information needed to neutralize this invasion, from which his regime actually emerged even stronger, increasing its national aura as the humble island that had defeated the invasion of the empire. It was at this point that Fidel publicly and formally embraced the banner of communism and his formal alignment with the Soviet Union. He declared Cuba a socialist country on May 1, 1961, and would go on to declare himself several times as a Marxist-Leninist.
In the great patriotic war against fascism, it lost many more lives than the entire population of Cuba. To defend its right to exist and to create the enormous wealth it has today, it did not hesitate to risk a tough war in defense of our small country. That is internationalism, that is communism. Long live communism, homeland or death, communism. Homeland.
The following year, after the Bay of Pigs, the famous missile crisis happened in 1962, where, although Cuba ended up humiliated as a subordinate state of the Soviet Union, the crisis also served to sell the international image of a Cuban regime that was now endorsed by the international powers. And this relationship and support from the Soviet Union would be key to the very existence of the Castro regime in the coming decades. So Fidel Cardenas Fidel, from the moment the revolution came to power, would go on building, sometimes abruptly, sometimes little by little, a political system in Cuba where the Revolutionary Party, as the representative of the people, would become fully integrated into all the structures of the state and civil society. As the leading entity, Cuba would formally remain a republic, but the state would officially adopt the socialist doctrine, inspired by Marxism, Leninism, and the processes. The revolutionary forces are grouped under the command of Fidel, and in 1962, the United Party of the Cuban Socialist Revolution is founded, which becomes the official single party in Cuba. To this day, and shortly after, it will change its name to the Communist Party of Cuba.
Whoever doesn't have revolutionary genes, whoever doesn't have revolutionary blood, whoever doesn't have a mind that adapts to the idea of a revolution, whoever doesn't have a heart that adapts to the effort and heroism of a revolution. We don't want them, we don't need them.
In the Cuban political system, elections are held for local and regional positions, as well as for the assembly, a process that is strictly controlled by the high command of the single party. The major decisions of Cuba and of this system will fall to its supreme leader, Fidel Castro, who will formally serve as prime minister. Until 1976, the Cuban state was reorganized, and from then on, his position would be president of the councils of state. The Cuban is who he is, especially in his early years. Castrismo will face considerable internal opposition in Cuba from different sectors. In its early years, Castrismo will face considerable internal opposition in Cuba from sources other than the Communist Party. So Fidel Castro manages to overcome all these economic, political, and social problems for almost 50 years, thanks to the discipline of the party and the strong repressive apparatus, along with the careful and strategic isolation of the island, Fidel Castro. The man is going to develop a seductive way of speaking, able to choose the right words at the right moment, with great precision. Fidel, that level of persuasion that reached the highest leaders around the world, combined with his infinite, unscrupulous cunning, that would mark his regime, but also his human relationships. Fidel managed to keep much of his private life out of the spotlight, which remains a mystery to this day. Cases like his little sister Juanita, who never supported him or the revolution, have given people something to discuss. And because of this, she had to go into exile and separate from her family. Or the case of his second wife, whose first public appearance was after Fidel resigned from power in 2008. But let's go back to the lives of millions of Cubans under the rule of Fidel Castro. Before we talk clearly about the Cuban economic model, there's a first unavoidable topic that stirs up passions, which is the famous United States embargo on the island of Cuba. These embargo measures, blockades, and restrictions have changed over the decades since they began, with some periods being milder and others being stricter. Above all, they've restricted the use of dollars per person. The embargo, in most cases, has never prevented Cuba from trading with a large number of countries, as it has always done up to this day, including the United States itself, which since the year 2000 especially, has relaxed much of its own sanctions and has expanded the import and export of products with Cuba. This happened at a time when the Castro regime was more economically weakened. This policy was sponsored by a personal visit of David Rockefeller to the island of Cuba. So, although the United States embargo has made Cuba's economic development more difficult, this embargo cannot be explained as the cause of Cuba's precarious economic reality, especially when compared to other countries that have suffered sanctions for several decades and have never reached Cuba's state. That being said, let's see what Fidel Castro did with the Cuban economy when the revolution came to power, economically speaking. The socialist-inspired thesis of the Cuban Revolution was the construction of an economy directed by the party and the state, an economy at the service of the people's interests. So in the early years, Fidel Castro's government nationalized the country's main companies and industries, as well as the banking sector. At the same time, a series of broad social programs are created, which become complex expenses for the state. Large amounts of land are also nationalized for agricultural collectivization, and, ultimately, the revolutionary government becomes the governing and centralizing entity of the island's economic decisions.
Therefore, all the companies of the electric company are nationalized. All the companies of the electric company, all the assets, of course, and the companies of Texaco and E. And also the 36 sugar mills that they had.
And many numbers are in plain sight. In the period between 1958 and 2008, there is a decline in almost all indicators. Throughout that period, the gross domestic product decreased by 26%, with some periods of stagnation or very slight growth, and other long periods of economic contraction. And therefore, the purchasing power of all Cubans, sugar production during that time between 1958 and, which was Cuba's historic sector, decreased by 87%. Tobacco production decreased by 75%. Coffee production by 93%. At the same time, Cuba's external debt per capita in foreign currency increased by almost 3,300% during that period. And the gross domestic product deficit compared to government spending increased by 850%. At the same time, a feature of this economy, which, for various reasons subject to debate, never manages to develop great productive capacities. It's because for a long time it maintained a great dependence on its main trading partners. Such is the case with the Soviet Union until its collapse, and with Venezuela from 1999 until the year 2026. Both trade relationships, which were very favorable to Cuba, became a way to sustain the Cuban system before it developed its own industry and productive economy. It is worth mentioning that Che Guevara played a prominent role in the construction of this economic model. As president of the National Bank of Cuba and as Minister of Industry for 4 years, years of massive nationalizations and the greatest contraction of Cuban production in a long time. For many Cubans, the period from 1958 to 2008 is the story of a long stagnation and a prolonged crisis, with high levels of unemployment and very low wages, which, added to the cases of political persecution, result in more than 1 million Cubans who have left the island since 1959. In the last 50 years, Cuba has experienced a marked depopulation due to mass migration and a decline in births. The nutrition of Cubans, a fundamental aspect that goes beyond simply eating, is actually something essential for the overall development of any human being. It was also drastically affected after the arrival of the revolution. the extensive agrarian reform implemented since 1959 and the subsequent policies of that system of government, worsened in turn by various sanctions imposed on the government, this has caused a substantial decline in the production of meat, eggs, rice, vegetables, and legumes throughout the country. In response to this, Fidel Castro also established the controversial ration books in 1962, aiming to regulate the consumption of the island's inhabitants. According to official figures, the real minimum wage of a Cuban decreased by 76% from 1989 to 2008. On the other hand, during much of Fidel Castro's revolutionary government, there was a certain hostility toward religious institutions, especially those that opposed Castroism in Cuba. The Church and the Catholic faith are now considered by much of the ruling party as the opium of the people. And although the Cuban Republic already had a secular character under Castro's government, the secular and atheist nature of the Republic of Cuba would be strengthened. Another fundamental effect of the decades of Castroism is that as the private sector in the economy shrank, the formal workforce increasingly shifted toward the public sector. And in fact, today, nearly 80% of formal workers in Cuba are employed in some direct or indirect branch of the public sector. And the rest would be either informal workers or employees of private companies of some kind. And what about in the field of education? Fidel's revolutionary Cuba will be largely inspired by the school books of the Soviet Union, which are translated into Spanish by revolutionary publishers. They publish whatever the Communist Party of Cuba considers relevant. And the same happens in the field of official culture, where Cuba shifts from its Republican liberal capitalist style to the purest exaltation of patriotic values under the symbols and mythology of the July 26th movement, now with a dose of Marxism-Leninism, since it had already acquired its communist connotation. And now, with the strengthening of Cuba's relations with the Soviet Union, part of the culture in Cuba is going to become Sovietized. And there's a clash between Soviet communism and Cuban communism, where the former in the Republic of Cuba is going to have more prominence. It was Lisandro Otero, an intellectual sympathetic to the revolution, who came to speak for many of his colleagues when, in the 1970s, he gave his opinion. In the revolution, there was a whole current of freshness, spontaneity, and originality, which disappeared when we began to try increasingly Soviet models of behavior, from the red scarves to centralized planning. End quote. That's how the life of that stagnant and blockaded Cuba is marked. A Caribbean version of the Soviet model, with imported cars from the Soviet Union that still drive through the streets of Cuba. The television stations that broadcast whatever is relevant for the state. The pamphlets and murals of the revolution that decorate the old and partially collapsed buildings, as well as the old textbooks for schools translated into Russian and Spanish. The relentless heat of the tropics, the cheerful rhythms of salsa and boleros adorn this new stage for the Cubans. The same ones who face up to 18 hours of blackouts and long lines for supplies. This is the new nation that the revolution offers them in these early years of the revolution. Fidel Castro, along with the other leaders, will form the so-called military units to aid production, where nearly 30,000 young people will end up, accused, falsely or truthfully, of not wanting to perform mandatory military service, of being drug addicts, or of being homosexuals. Political prisoners are also part of this system, in which Fidel Castro himself admits in 1979 that 4,500 people were being held for having committed political crimes. Many of these people would not see freedom until many years later. The foreign policy carried out by Fidel Castro is also worthy of study, as he turned a small Caribbean island into one of the most influential centers in the entire region. A large part of that initial power came from his relationship with the Soviet Union. In February 1960, Cuba and the Soviet Union signed their first trade agreement for $100 million. In this agreement, the island would exchange 5 million tons of sugar for petroleum, wheat byproducts, iron, fertilizers, machinery, and technical assistance for the construction of industrial plants. And after that, Cuba began signing trade agreements with satellite countries, or those very close to it, like China, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, which became the main buyers of Cuban sugar. And this trade with the Soviet bloc would also provide Cuba with significant assistance and military power, so that Soviet support, with the apparent and secret complicity of the United States, plus his charismatic figure, they would give Fidel Castro the possibility of becoming the main representative of the global left in Latin America and the Caribbean. At the same time, they ensure the consolidation of his regime. From there, he also dedicates himself to training, financing, or helping revolutionary movements in other nations, promoting everything from political parties and guerrillas to military uprisings and revolutionary movements of various kinds. That is what he would do in cases like Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Congo, Algeria, Syria, Ethiopia, among others. And beyond the Soviet power, this was not the only reflection of Cuba's foreign relations. Under the command of Fidel Castro, who, wrapped in his mythological aura and by the power granted to him by both the revolution and the Soviet Union, went on to visit a large number of countries on every continent. During the 50 years in which he governed and during the 1980s, Cuban politics enjoyed a brief period of relaxation. There was a gradual improvement in the economy, but this collapsed with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, which marked the beginning of the so-called special period, lasting from 1991 to the year 2000. During this time, Cuba faced serious problems in public services, food, health, and the economy, since the substantial aid they used to receive from the Soviet Union came to an end. And during those years, social protests against the regime multiplied, and in response, political repression increased. The most memorable protest of the special period was on August 5, 1994, known as the Maleconazo. Fidel Castro faces this new crisis in Cuba while also looking for new allies, and he will find them not only among the usual ones. Years later, just like in Russia, China, Nicaragua, and other countries with socialist tendencies. But by the late 90s, he will gain two new major allies. On one hand, powerful American sectors, led by magnates like David Rockefeller and figures like Bill Clinton. They begin an agenda to intensify the rapprochement between the United States and Cuba, which will be achieved in the early 2000s. A large part of the so-called American blockade is eased, and major trade agreements are reached between American businessmen and the island, which was very weakened. At the same time, the other great ally that Fidel Castro gains is Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, a project that had already been around for a long time, which is strengthened by a Chavez, who saw Castro as a mentor and a guide for many years. Venezuela is going to provide oil under privileged conditions and large financial credits to the island, which will be a great help for the country's economy. And for Fidel's rule? In this way, Castro manages during this period to move Cuba from being an isolated country at risk of total economic collapse during the 1990s to being a country with good international relations with other nations and relative stability, which allows the regime its own continuity into the 21st century. With the substantial resources coming from Venezuela from the year 2000 onward, Cubans have seen a slight improvement in their living conditions. Courtesy of the government of Hugo Chavez, this is the scenario that Fidel Castro sees in his final years as the official top leader of the island. When he finally decides not to be re-elected by the Cuban Assembly as President of the Council of State, leaving his brother Raul Castro as the new president of the same on February 24th, 2008. A monarchy or lifelong republic in which Castro, even though retired, would still be the sovereign of Cuba for major decisions. So he leaves the presidency of the Council of State at the age of 82 and lives a few more years, long enough to admit in various interviews and biographies that the Cuban model doesn't even work for us, as he said in 2010. And on several occasions, he also acknowledged the very poor results that the revolution had brought to Cuba. But by the time he made those statements, nothing could change what had happened in the last 50 years. Fidel Castro, now in his 80s, continues to receive visits at his home in Havana from presidents and personalities who passed through Cuba. His private life was and still is a mystery in many ways. His alleged fortune, estimated by Forbes magazine, would be $900 million. This is the subject of speculation and debate. For example, he is allegedly said to have become the owner of a complex network of state companies throughout Cuba that Castro managed. A normal day in 2016, as the end of that year was approaching. President Raul Castro issued a statement on Cuban television at 10:45 p.m. on November 25, announcing the death of his brother, Commander Fidel Castro Ruz, the man who ruled the island of Cuba with an iron fist for 50 years. The revolutionary of the poor, who came from the elite, who forever changed not only that island, which he plunged into stagnation, but also forever changed the politics of all of the Americas. The funeral ceremonies after his death last from November 28th to December 4th. After the ceremonies, a caravan is held that follows the route in reverse. The route that Fidel had taken from Santiago de Cuba to Triunfal in Havana when the victory of the revolution was announced. On December 4th, Fidel's ashes arrive in Santiago de Cuba, and they are placed in a small urn, which will then be put into a stone-shaped niche. All of this takes place in the presence of 75 heads of state and more than 100 representatives from different governments and political organizations from all over the world. Thus died that man who in a way had ceased to be and had become an entire state. In an idea and in a global flag that many still wave proudly. Is Fidel Castro's revolution a revolution for humanity? The result of his work? Today, it is that of a stagnant, fragmented, and impoverished Cuba, which will require the constant effort and intelligence of Cubans to reach a new and better destination. Thank you all very much for watching this video. I remind you that your support means a lot to us by leaving your comments, giving us a like, subscribing to the channel, sharing the video with all your friends, and clicking the bell to activate notifications. This is Reynaldo Jose Carrillo Vilches speaking to you, and this is the New Encyclopedia. As always, we thank you for all your support and many blessings to everyone.